relatively fully in the full condition that we recognize today by James Parkinson. And it affects around 1.5% of everyone over age 60. Now, the frequency of Parkinson's is increasing. We know it's increasing primarily because people are living longer. And I'm not sure if this, can you see the cursor? There we go. So this shows the rate of increase around the world. The red countries include China, India, parts of Southeast Asia. That's where Parkinson's is increasing most rapidly because the populations there are beginning to age. The rest of the world, Europe and the United States, it's increasing not quite as dramatically, but still substantially. And again, that's related to the aging of the population. So a little bit about the pathology of Parkinson's disease. This is a picture of a part of the brain called the substantia nigra, which means black substance. And as you can see here on the left, there are some very dark areas here in the brain that are absent in this image, which is from a patient who had Parkinson's disease. And most of the motor symptoms that we recognize as Parkinson's disease clinically are related to the loss of neurons specifically in this tiny little area of the brain. But we now know that Parkinson's disease is a systemic disease, that it affects the entire body. And the primary pathologic observation in neurons in the brain are called Lewy bodies. And this is an image of a Lewy body. This is the Lewy body in the neuron. And the composition of this Lewy body, which is found in neurons that are damaged and possibly dying, was unknown until fairly recently, until the late 90s. And we now know, there was a great discovery, we now know what makes up the Lewy body. It's a protein primarily called alpha-synuclein. And we think that this protein is intimately related to Parkinson's disease, both as a cause and probably related to the progression of the illness. There are some challenges in studying the causes of Parkinson's disease. First of all, there's no diagnostic test. It's a clinical diagnosis. And it can be a wrong diagnosis. It's a disease of aging with a long preclinical period. So that means if we're trying to identify environmental exposures or other causes, they may have occurred decades before the disease manifests, which makes it really difficult for us to identify those exposures. And currently, we can't diagnose Parkinson's disease until it becomes symptomatic. That may be changing, and there are huge efforts underway right now to try to identify Parkinson's disease very early on, because we think that medications and interventions to slow the progression are most likely to be effective if we catch it early. And we think that probably up to 5 times as many people have Parkinson's disease occurring, but they never get to the point where it becomes apparent. And we've learned this through studies, through autopsy studies, where people who have no symptoms whatsoever actually have Lewy bodies in their brains. So Parkinson's disease is probably much more common than we know. So I'm going to talk about the descriptive epidemiology, which is understanding who gets PD. Well, the greatest risk factor is aging. This chart shows the incidence, which is the rate of new cases of Parkinson's disease as a function of age. So it's quite rare under the age of 50, and it accelerates pretty rapidly thereafter. What you can also see from this is that it affects men more frequently than women. maybe up to twice as often, but at least 50% more. And we don't know why that is, but that's certainly a clue that there's something related to gender. Could be occupation, could be lifestyle, could be hormonal. The rate of Parkinson's is not constant around the world. We're not sure what this means, but it seems to be quite a bit lower in some regions, in Asia and in Africa, and it seems to be highest in Northern Europe and the US. Now that may just be because we have better doctors, or it may be related to risk factors. Also, Parkinson's disease varies across ethnic groups. It seems to be more common in Hispanics, less common in Asians and blacks. So we know Parkinson's occurs everywhere in the world. It mostly occurs over age 50. It increases with age. It's more common in men. It may be increasing over time. We don't know. And it may be related to where people live. Excuse me for clearing my throat. So, the debate. This has been going on for 100 years. Is Parkinson's genetic or is it environmental? In the late 20th century, there were two major discoveries. This unattractive photograph is a garage in Northern California where a compound called MPTP was synthesized by individuals who were trying to make a drug similar to Demerol to abuse. I'll get back to this in a moment. The other major discovery was the first genetic association. A small family derived from southern Italy was discovered. And the mutation that they had was identified in a gene called alpha-synuclein. More water, thank you. Alpha-synuclein, as I mentioned, is the primary component of the Lewy body. So this was a huge advance. And initially, it was thought that we had discovered the genetic basis of Parkinson's disease. But in fact, this was an extremely rare genetic mutation. Several other mutations were also discovered a few years after that. One is called Parkin. Parkin is a common cause of very young onset Parkinson's disease. But it is not a common cause of typical Parkinson's disease. And it's inherited in an autosomal recessive fashion, which means that both parents need to carry the mutation. Another important gene that was discovered is in a gene called LRRK2. It turns out LRRK2 is probably the most common genetic cause of Parkinson's disease, but it's only responsible for about 1%. In some populations, this is much more frequent. In European Jews and in North Africans, it can be up to 20 or even 40%. But overall, it's about 1%. These, I don't expect anyone to be able to read this, these are all genes that have been linked either with causing Parkinson's or with increasing the risk of Parkinson's. It's a long list, and it gets longer every day. But most people don't have one of these genes. And if they do, it increases their risk only slightly, and I'll talk about that more. We conducted this study of twins that is one of the more important studies trying to get at the question of whether Parkinson's is genetic or environmental. We studied 30,000 twins. We identified all the individuals who had Parkinson's. And then we looked to see if one twin had Parkinson's, did their co-twin also have it? We looked in identical and in fraternal twins. And if the identical twins had Parkinson's much more frequently, then that would mean that Parkinson's is primarily genetic. They didn't. We found very similar proportions of affected co-twins in both identical and fraternal twins. And so the conclusion from this is that environment is a major determinant of Parkinson's disease risk. That's what we studied at the Parkinson's Institute. We also study genetic factors, but we're focused on the environment. Primarily, for me, it's because we can change environment. It's much more difficult to change genetics, although that may not hold true in the future. I talked about that garage in Northern California, that garage where this compound, MPTP, was being synthesized. Dr. Bill Langston, who founded the Parkinson's Institute, was the discoverer of this compound. He found it because suddenly there was a large group of young people showing up to emergency rooms in Silicon Valley who looked like they had very severe Parkinson's. They developed it overnight. The compound was identified as MPTP, and the mechanism by which MPTP causes Parkinsonism was worked out. So, this is the chemistry part. The molecule here on the left crosses into the brain, and it gets trapped in the brain, specifically in the part of the brain, the substantia nigra, that's affected in Parkinson's disease. In the brain, it is toxic to what are called mitochondria. Mitochondria are the energy furnaces of the cells. And it's this toxicity to the mitochondria that seems to cause the injury to the neurons in that part of the brain that are affected in Parkinson's. That was a huge clue that perhaps compounds out in the environment that worked by a similar mechanism, affected these mitochondria, might cause Parkinson's disease. So the search for Parkinson's disease in the environment began. First, a disclaimer. Now, in epidemiology, we make associations. We say something is more common in one group than another. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is causing it. So we say association does not prove causation. In order to prove that something causes something, we need to replicate the finding. We need to replicate it again, we need to replicate it in the lab, and we need to understand the mechanism by which it may be working. So, what are the environmental risk factors that we've identified? Smoking. As many of you probably know, smoking is inversely related to Parkinson's disease. Sad but true. I do not advocate anyone taking up smoking. But it has been linked with a reduced risk of Parkinson's disease in more than 50 studies all around the world, and it seems to be a dose-response effect, meaning the more you smoke, the lower your risk of Parkinson's. This chart shows a whole bunch of studies. This line in the center is what we call a risk of 1, meaning just typical risk. Anything to the right of that line is a study that found an increased risk in smokers. Anything to the left, they found a decreased risk. It's pretty clear that smoking is strongly associated with a reduced risk of Parkinson's disease. We conducted a study in our group of twins that I already mentioned to look at smoking. So we looked within our 32,000 twin population. We identified all the pairs where one twin had PD and or both had PD, and then we asked them questions about how much they'd smoked over their lifetimes. What we found, so these are discordant, means one twin has PD and the other doesn't. And what we found was that the twin who had PD smoked on average considerably less than the twin who had PD. I'm sorry, than the twin who didn't have PD. So the twin who didn't have PD smoked about 10 pack years, meaning a pack a day for 10 years more than their co-twin. Even when we looked at twin pairs where both twins had Parkinson's, we found that the twin who smoked more got their Parkinson's at a later age. This is very strong evidence that smoking has a real effect on reducing Parkinson's risk. So how does it do it? Nicotine has been shown to be protective in a range of animal models. It can protect against, for example, MPTP, that compound that I showed you. It can prevent that toxicity. It can prevent death of neurons from a variety of toxic insults. And there are now some ongoing trials looking at nicotine patches as a way to slow disease progression. Alternatively, smoking is toxic to the body, and it increases levels of detoxifying enzymes in the liver, for example. And it may be that those higher levels of those enzymes are now fighting some other toxin that ultimately is responsible for Parkinson's. It also affects some enzymes in the brain, and then there are thousands of compounds in cigarette smoke, and it may not be nicotine at all. Coffee drinking. We need to refill that pot. Coffee drinking has been associated with a reduced risk of Parkinson's disease as well. So cigarettes and coffee, I don't know. This is a study from our colleagues in Hawaii. Did a large study, and they measured coffee drinking in midlife in individuals who then went on to develop Parkinson's disease. You can see a very clear, what we call dose response. The more you drink, the lower the risk of Parkinson's. And again, this has been replicated in very many studies around the world. This line is no difference in risk. Every line to every study to the left means a reduced risk of Parkinson's. So this is quite a consistent observation. Why? We don't know. It might be caffeine. There are some receptors in the brain that obviously we know it's a mild stimulant. It may be related to that, but the relationship between caffeine and Parkinson's disease is not understood. Another risk factor is head injury. Most of you are probably familiar with that Muhammad Ali has Parkinson's, and in fact he probably had Parkinson's for a while toward the end of his career, which is why he started losing fights at the end of his career, because he was slowing down. Most studies have found a moderately increased risk of Parkinson's disease associated with head injury. I'll talk about that more. The reason that's so important is because head injuries are extremely common. There are 2 to 3 million a year just in the US, if head injury increases the risk of Parkinson's, this is a major factor that we need to address. This just shows the rate of head injuries. This is age on the bottom, and you can see that the frequency of head injuries, as you might expect, is high in infants and toddlers. It's high in adolescents when they learn to drive, and it moves back up with age. Back to our twins. But I should mention, twins are an excellent population in which to study environmental risk factors because they're matched on their genes. So if we find differences, then we are pretty certain that they're related to the environmental factor that we're studying. So that's why we keep putting the twins up here. In the twins, we found about a 400% increased risk of Parkinson's disease in the twin who had a head injury. And these are not severe head injuries. These are mild concussions for the most part. And risk is even higher if they had more than one. What's really interesting is that the injuries tended to occur 30 to 40 years before they develop Parkinson's disease. Meaning that there's the possibility of intervening during that period of time with preventive therapies if we can develop preventive therapies. It's a long developmental process. Even in the concordant twins, where both had Parkinson's disease, the twin who had a head injury was much more likely to be the twin who developed Parkinson's disease first. Now, head injury severity, what we observe clinically, does not necessarily translate to what happens in the brain. This is a PET scan showing 3 brains. This is the normal. This is a severe head injury with a person who was in a coma. This is a mild head injury with someone who had brief memory loss but was otherwise